right. One of the things that I really appreciate about the book of Isaiah, that I'm coming to appreciate more and more, is that it really is a message of God's judgment and God's wrath on these people, his chosen people who are supposed to be following him and have not been following him. And so he talks about, this is the end. You've reached the end of my patience, and this is what's going to happen. And it's not going to be a happy day. But what I find just amazing about the character of God in the midst of all this is he continues to bring in little glimmers of hope and pictures of, it's going to be difficult, but there's still going to be some hope. Even in the midst of your difficulties, in the midst of these trials that are going to happen to you, there's going to be hope. And so there's this great thread of redemption that just flows all through the book. And we're going to look at one of those this morning again. In 1967, it was July the 30th, there was a young lady that was hanging out with some of her friends. And this young lady was the youngest of 4 daughters, so she was probably the spoiled baby, as some of you are. And just loved life. She loved horseback riding. She loved anything to do with the outdoors. She was just full of life. And she and her 4 friends went up to Chesapeake Bay to go swimming. And she dove into the water and misjudged the depth and broke her neck right above the shoulders. And since then, Johnny Erickson Tata has been paralyzed. And she writes in her book about how the first 2 years were just horrible. She considered, she wasn't able to very well, but she thought about suicide and went into some very deep depressions. She really questioned if she had any faith in God. But for any of you that know her, you know that the darkest hour of her night has resulted in an amazing ministry to this day. And she's still, I recently heard that she's working through breast cancer now. So life is something in which we are constantly greeted with the reality of pain and suffering. And the truth of the matter is that some of you have been through some horrific experiences in life already. I know that some of you have been abused. Some of you are suffering from very traumatic relationships. Some of you have come through situations where you have literally been on the brink of death. Some of you have wrestled through some incredible debilitating diseases. And in quite honestly, some of us will encounter that in the future. It is part of existence. It's part of the human existence. It's part of life. And in fact, some of you are in the midst of that right now. So the message that Isaiah and that God has for us this morning is a message to help us beyond those times. And let me just say that the suggestions that Isaiah makes to us, that I believe that Isaiah is making to us, may seem like pat answers. And I just want to say to you that any answer that God gives is never a pat answer. It may seem like a pat answer. It may just seem simplistic, and I've heard that before. But I want to tell you that these answers that God wants to share this morning are fresh and new to you, and God has something to say through them to you in a new way this morning. And I also want to just say that if you're in the midst of something right now, it may be difficult for you to hear this. When a person is in the midst of intense stress and things that are happening in their life, their emotions are in so much turmoil that it's really difficult to receive information at that point. When I go to a chaplain call, I give out the very minimal amount of information as I can, and I always try and leave something that's written down for them, because inevitably by the time I've left, they have no idea what I said after I'm gone. And they only need to know a couple of things just to get them through the next few days. And so this may be information that I don't know, you may write down or maybe listen to at some other point in your life when you're beyond this, if you're in the midst of one right now. I don't know how God will help you at this point, but it's important for us to understand. And let me also just say that if you are ever in a situation where you're providing comfort to somebody who is in the midst of tragedy or loss or some sort of trauma of life, it's the last thing to do at that point is to hear advice or solutions or pithy sayings. What they really need from you at that time is just simply your presence. And you provide the presence of God in a literal way. And just sitting quietly, and most of you introverts, that's a great thing. You do that very well. Don't have to say anything. You can say expressions of affection and love and sympathy, sincere sympathy. I'm really sorry you're going through this right now. But it's probably not the time to provide solutions to the drama or tragedies of their life. But I want to look with you at Isaiah, and this is God's response. And let me just also, I just want to read a little something to you that I came across this week, just sort of as we prepare ourselves for this and look into this passage. This is, I think, will help us give perspective to this particular topic. This on May the 7th of 2000, about 13 years ago, Dr. James Montgomery Boyce stood in his pulpit for the last time to speak about his cancer that would take his life in a month. Here is an excerpt from his last message, a month before he died, and he knew that his death was imminent. If I were to reflect on what goes on theologically here, there are two things that I would stress. One is the sovereignty of God. That's not novel. We've talked about the sovereignty of God here forever. God is in charge. When things like this come into our lives, they are not accidental. It's not as if God somehow forgot what was going on and something bad slipped by. It's not the answer that Harold Kushner gave in his book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. God does everything according to his will. We've always said that. But what I've been impressed with mostly is something in addition to that. It's possible, isn't it, to conceive of God as sovereign and yet indifferent. God is in charge, but he doesn't care. But it's not that. God is not only the one who is in charge, God is also good. Everything he does is good. And what Romans 12, 1 through 2 says is that we have the opportunity by the renewal of our minds, that is how we think about these things, actually to prove what God's will is. And then it says, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Is that good, pleasing, and perfect to God? Yes, of course. But the point of it is that it is good, pleasing, and perfect to us. If God does something in your life, would you change it? If you'd change it, you'd make it worse. It wouldn't be as good. That's the way we want to accept it and move forward. And who knows what God will do. And then I was reminded of this verse in Romans 8:28. And we know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So we need to keep those truths in mind, that not only is God actively involved in our life, but the things that happen in our life are for our good. And oftentimes our prayer to remove these things from our life is actually thwarting what God truly wants to do. And one of the things that we often find ourselves doing when we get into these situations is asking the question, why? I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where someone would say to me, why is this happening to me? And the truth of the matter is that God doesn't ask. The Bible doesn't answer the why question. It was the question that Job asked from the very beginning through his whole trial. Why is this happening to me? And I suppose it is valid to at least ask yourself the question, is there something in my life that I have done that God is trying to correct? And perhaps that is why. But oftentimes the question why is actually destructive. And I think that's why the Bible doesn't give us the answer to why, because the answer to why leads us into a spiral of despair. And I think it's much better to ask the question, what? What does this mean? What does this mean God wants to do in my life? maybe you could say, why is God allowing this? Or where will this take me? And what does God want to accomplish through this? And I think those are much more healthier questions to ask in the midst of the dramas and tragedies of our life. So, Jeremiah chapter 34, we're going to start with verse 11. We're just ignoring the chapters this morning. And let me read a section to you, and then I'll make a suggestion as to what I think that he's talking about. But I would ask that you allow the passage to speak from God to you. So Isaiah chapter 34. Did I say something other than Isaiah? Oh yeah, Jeremiah. He's that other guy. Isaiah, Jeremiah's buddy. Chapter 34, and it's the 11th verse I'm going to start at. The desert owl and the screech owl will possess it. The great owl and the raven will nest there. God will stretch out over Edom the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of desolation. So he's talking about what's going to happen after this country is destroyed that they're living in, after the end of this tragedy. Her nobles will have nothing there to be called a kingdom. All her princes will vanish away. Thorns will overrun her citadels, nettles and brambles her strongholds. She will become a haunt for the jackal, a home for the owls. Desert creatures will meet with hyenas, and wild goats will bleat to each other. There the night creatures will also repose and find themselves places of rest. The owl will nest there and lay eggs. Do you see the immersion of hope in creation that's coming from the desolation? The owl will nest there and lay eggs. She will hatch them and care for her young under the shadow of her wings. There also the falcons will gather, each with its mate. Look in the scroll of the Lord and read. None of these will be missing, not one will lack her mate, for it is as his mouth that has given the order, and his spirit will gather them together. His allots and their portions, his hand distributes them by measure. They will possess it forever and dwell there from generation to generation. The deserts and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like crocuses, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it. So what we have here is a picture of incredible desolation, but out of that desolation begins to grow the renewal of creation. And in fact, the very place that is once desolate is now a place where animals are habitating and bearing young, and where flowers are starting to blossom and things are starting to grow. And so the first thing that I believe that God says to us is, in the message of hope, is that we need to look for the good things to come out of the bad things. We need to anticipate and expect that out of the deserts of these situations that there will be flowers bloomed. And if we look back again at the life of Joni Eareckson, she's written over probably 40 books. She's produced a number of music albums. She's a noted artist. She paints with her mouth. She's an amazing public speaker and has literally spoken to people all over the world. And there's just no end to the way that God has used her and transformed her and given her the ability to speak and to speak into someone's life. So we could say that we would never want to say that evil or bad things are a good thing. But in reality, in enduring those things, it does give a person the validity to speak to other people who are going through those difficult times as well. And it gives you simply the credibility. I know that when I'm talking with people, one of the things that I can share with people that are suffering, who have lost a parent, is I can say, I know what it feels like to lose a parent. I'm really sorry for what you're going through. I went through that with my father. And so there is a connection there. There is some validity in my saying that I can identify with what you're saying there. So the bad can bring good, and we need to expect and to look forward to this and to be praying and saying, God, how will you be glorified in this? How will you bring the renewal of your creation? How will what I'm going through be part of your rescue plan? And sometimes in the midst of that is really difficult to see, but we need to trust that God ultimately will make that happen. It's his plan. Let me continue on. The splendor of Carmel and Sharon, they will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hand, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong and do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. And the reality is that in the midst of these trials, God does use them to strengthen us. Strength does come out of the difficulties of trials. And another thing that's fascinating to me is that oftentimes in the midst of these, we see the weaknesses that we could never see before. Our lameness is not even apparent to us, and we suddenly discover that we're very lame. Some of you shared about learning, or I even shared this morning, about learning to trust God in areas I didn't know I didn't trust him in. Or what Christina shared about, she didn't really realize that this was an area. And so this instance allowed her to realize that this was an area that she needed to focus on. It reminds me a little bit of a couple things in my own life. I have strabismus, which means that I only see out of one eye at a time, so I have no 3D vision. Doesn't do me a bit of good to wear those silly glasses. It looks exactly the same whether I have them on or not. But the funny thing is that I was married for, maybe a decade before I realized that my vision was different than anybody else. I was having a conversation with Jean, and we were talking about something, and she was describing it. Wait a minute, what are you saying? And I realized that, for example, sometimes when I'm pouring a glass of water, I miss the glass because I use different methods of depth perception than you do. I can't triangulate. I have to estimate. And I don't always estimate exactly right. I just presumed everybody did it that way. And so you say, no, your eyes triangulate. You're kidding. Really? That's not fair. So I wasn't even aware of my lameness until, it's not a big deal to me now, but I just think that sometimes the drama or the tragedies, the difficulties in life expose those areas of weakness to us. And I believe as we expose them, it is our responsibility to say, Lord, this is not something I want to be a part of my life. Most of you, I realize, are introverts, and public speaking is not your forte. It's not something you enjoy. It's not something that I initially enjoyed. I was terrorized by it. I can remember the first time I got up and did a public presentation in high school. To this day, I can tell you where I was standing. I can visualize the table. I literally know some of the names of the students that were in that room. To this day, I can see them. Jeff is sitting right over there. Some other people, some of the girls that never mind. But it was horrible. It was a disaster. But at some point, I had to go back and visualize that experience and say, you know what? If I could go back and do that now, it would be totally different. I could do that well, not because I'm an extrovert and I'm a great public speaker, but because of the fact that I have spent many, many hours training myself to do something that I'm not comfortable doing. And even now, I spend a lot of hours every week preparing for this. It may seem like I'm just entirely comfortable up here and I'm just naturally this. I'm not. The only reason I can do this is because of the hours and hours I've spent practicing what exactly am I going to say to you up here every morning. So my point is that in the midst of these difficult things that God shows to you, he wants to give you the ability to deal with them and move beyond them. Let me just give you a very practical way of something that most of you are terrified about, and that's our sharing time. I recognize and realize that the extroverts are the ones that normally share. That most of you don't, because it's a terrifying thing. And the reason is because one of the characteristics of an extrovert is that they can speak spontaneously. They can just stand up at a moment's notice and talk about anything. Whereas an introvert needs to sit and think about what they're going to say before they say it. So for me to just jump up and say something, You aren't going to do that. I wouldn't do that. If I'm in a pastor's conference and they say, okay, let's spontaneously share ideas about this, I'm not saying nothing. I want to think about what I'm going to say. So my suggestion to you is plan for this day. Write something down. Take some time this week and say, God, what is it that you want to say through me? Maybe it's just a passage of Scripture. That's all you have to say is, I want to read this. Or, I want to share this thought with you and read it. Or sometimes Mark has written poems. Great. Not that you're necessarily poets, but that may be a way. So the point is, in these trials, isn't just simply to excuse ourselves and say, well, I'm just lame. That's just how I am. I think that God wants us to get beyond those things and to say, you know what? I don't want to be the lame the rest of my life. I want to be able to say the amazing things that God is doing in our lives. And in reality, there are many things that introverts have to say about life that extroverts will never see. And that's true of extroverts as well. But we are missing things in life because of some of your fears. And I just encourage you to say, God, I want to move beyond that, and this is one way you can do it. Learn who you are. Learn how you can overcome that part of you to become strong in that area of who you are. Not use it as an excuse. Okay. Let me read on a little more here. The next verse, it says, water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground, bubbling water. And I remember back vaguely in the 60s when JFK gave the speech. I'm sure I didn't watch it, but I remember the one famous line that he gave is, don't ask what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And the reality is that the greatest joy, the greatest satisfaction that you will get from life isn't from things that people give to you, but what you are able to give to other people. And one of the things that will come out of the deep, deep, difficult times in your life is your ability to give what you learned from those to other people. So you can become a well of water. You can become a strength. You can become a bubbling spring. You know, all of you know Carla, but very few of you know very much about her history. And I'm not free to tell you, but that lady has gone through 10 times as much as probably anybody else in this room in her life. I mean, you would just be astounded to know some of the stuff that she's gone through. And yet she can speak through that to us and talk about God in a very personal and powerful way. And so as you go through these times, make sure that you're asking God to give you a voice to share and to speak into other people, because in the future, other people are going to walk down the same path you're going down right now. And you don't want to just say, yeah, I did that. You want to be able to say, you know what? In the midst of that, God gave me great hope. He gave me great peace. God is faithful. He will take you through this too. So it can be a place where you can become a stream of water to other people. And then I'm going to read the last passage, but let me tell you what to look for before I read it, because the last point is that never give up on hope. Always cling to hope. And one good thing to remember is that it was a miracle that you came into this world. It wasn't perchance. You were one in millions, literally, of possibilities to be conceived on that particular moment. And you were the one that was conceived. Not only are you one in millions, but you have people that stretch out in your past, your ancestors who have gone through the most amazing things. Probably some of your ancestors came out here to the West, perhaps. Maybe they survived all kinds of hardships. I don't know where your ancestors were. Some of mine were part of the French Revolution. Some of my ancestors were signers of the Declaration of Independence. Some of them, I'm sure, were part of the Civil War, probably on both sides. Went through horrific times. And yet, some of those ancestors of mine still were faithful to God, and some of yours were as well. And it was those seeds of faithfulness that ultimately brought you here today. And so there is great hope in being a child of God and knowing that you are part of something which God started in the garden, went to Abraham, went to the disciples of Christ, followed down through the ages in the church, and brought you here today. And God's not done. And these are his words of hope to you. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow, and a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. The unclean will not journey on it. It will be for those who walk in that way. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor any of the ferocious beasts will get up on it. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them. Sorrow and sighing will flee away. And you know, we often say that that's eternity, but I believe it's also the end of the dark, dark tunnel that God takes us through. I want to conclude with a benediction, but before that, I want to just take a minute, and our missionaries to Thailand are leaving again this Wednesday, and so I want to take a minute and pray for them. So Pat and Forrest, could you come up here, and maybe some others of you that want to can just join us, and we'll just make a circle around them right here and put our hands on them, and you can pick his pocket if you want.